So this is the second of three sessions on soils. And our speaker for this session, which is how to break up compaction and no-till and reduced-till systems, is Dr. Daigh. Aaron is associate professor of soil physics and hydrology with the soil science department at NDSU. And he's been with NDSU for a little over 7 years. He's originally from Arkansas. He got his PhD in soil science and environmental science at Iowa State University. And his responsibilities with his job include, he's got split appointments, 90% has research, and then the other 10% is with teaching. So he's a busy guy. I bet his actual time adds up to more than 100%. So with that, Aaron, you can take it away. And again, thank you very much for joining us and being a instructor with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to chat with everyone today. So today I was asked if I'd talk a little bit about breaking up compaction and no-till and reduced-till systems. So obviously I'm going to talk a little bit about roots just from the beginning stage here, as you can tell. But kind of along the way, some of the things to think about is this is mostly for y'all that have farmers who are kind of transitioning into no-till and reduced till system, something like a shallow vertical till or something like that. So if you've been in these systems for a long time, over a decade or so, then you probably don't have compaction issues. If you think you do have compaction issues, then it actually may be something else or not something to really take too much concern about. So this would be mostly important for folks that are looking to get into no-till and reduced till systems and those that are navigating kind of this transitional first 5 years getting into it. And we're going to cover a lot of things in the next 30 minutes, but let's see if I can get this to advance forward. There we go. So we'll cover a lot of things, but first off, I want to talk a little bit about how compaction is different these days because our equipment loads are quite a bit different. And that compaction can be quite costly, particularly after years like the 2019 harvest, which was quite wet and difficult, as we all know. So the reason why it's different these days is because if you look at equipment over the last set of decades, going back to the 1960s up to current, and you look at the wheel loads, and these graphs right here, the graph with the blue dots on them, that's in tons on the front wheel loads of combines. The red dots over here on the next graph is the rear wheels on tractors with and without pulling an implement on them. So you can see that our loads have gone up over the years. Equipment's bigger, they're heavier. And even here with these combines that are getting up 10 tons on the front wheel loads, this is still minor in comparison to some of our single axle grain carts that are out there that'll push 40-ton axle loads out there. So equipment's bigger, they're a lot heavier. And what this has done is that if you look at the stress that's induced into the soil and how deep that stress goes, it's also over the last several decades, it's gone right along with equipment size that compaction has gone deeper and deeper. And these dots right here represent kind of a well-established kind of metric for stresses that will cause compaction in most soils and result in some kind of substantial consequence on the crops for it. And I want to note that this kind of pink line right in the middle here, around 20 inches down, 20 inches, that's about as deep as you're going to reach with any implement that's available to you out there to try to mechanically alleviate compaction. Even with subsoilers, inline subsoilers, paraplows, stuff like that, it's the compaction on these high loads. When the compaction happens, they're deeper than our mechanical equipment can reach to. And so that has a lot of consequences. And so if you think about even underneath some light loads, like this diagram right here, to where it's only a little over 1,000-pound load on each tire, if you look at the depth in the soil profile and a couple graphs here, we're looking at bulk density as a measure of compaction here. The higher the value, the more compacted. You can kind of see that, a compacted soil, it'll be high in bulk density, and then it'll probably get less. This is the bulge where the compaction occurred, right here on these black solid dots right here. If you go in with something like a plow or other implement, you can cut down the compaction and the surface spot. But what I want you to see is that right below where that plow line is, or the tillage, the chisel line is, the compaction actually goes up a bit. And this is a classic plow pan that occurs. The plow pans occur right underneath the plow depth. They don't happen in the plow depth. They happen underneath it. So it kind of pushes the compaction a little bit deeper and alleviates the surface compaction for it. And you can see on these light loads, this is in the top, several inches up here, 4 to 8 inches. Which is your typical, chiseling kind of depths here. If compaction is getting down below 20 inches where you can't even reach it with subsoilers, then, our compaction has changed these days. But that plow pan still exists there. And it gets quite costly. Now, Jody DeJong Hughes at the University of Minnesota, one of my graduate students who messed with Charya and I, right after the 2019 fall harvest that happened, we knew that there's a lot of ruts out on fields, a lot of deep compaction occurring. And we wanted to get a projection of, what kind of economic costs is this deep compaction going to have directly on farmers, with loss in grain yields for the next few years and the cost to level out any ruts that were in their fields for it. And this is a lot of numbers, but what I want you to pay attention to is kind of this box in red down here. We did a review of the literature, particularly corn and soybean. And we looked and we said, okay, in these areas where we know deep compaction occurred because we had ruts and they get filled in for the next season for it. If we look at these areas where we know there's going to be a consequence, and we break it down into kind of like the bottom 25 percentile of how severe it is versus the 50th percentile. So right in the middle of the road, half the people are better off than you, half the people are worse off than you. And then up around the 75 percentile range. So this is getting into the kind of the worst of the worst. You can expect, in between a 15, 21, up to a 35% loss for the next 2 years in your yields in those areas that you have deep soil compaction. So compaction's a lot very costly these days, and it's different on what depths it's at. So it changes how what your options and tools are for approaching it. And we'll go through those options of what tends to be effective and what tends to not be effective, or at least not effective anymore because of how compaction has changed, particularly in these systems where you're transitioning into a no-till or reduced till system, such as a shallow vertical till. And the cost on these in these compacted areas from our economic analysis that we did is that, whether you look at the range of different possibilities of grain prices versus, the fraction of the land, whether it's 10%, 20%, 30% of all the fields had, deep compaction occur on them in 2019. No matter how you slice it, we're looking in the hundreds of millions of dollars of economic cost directly to farmers in between North Dakota and Minnesota. So it's very high consequence, and it's multi-year. This is over a 2-year consequence at least. And in those worst cases, they can also carry on for subsequent years as well. So how do you go about breaking up some of this compaction for it? So the first thing I want to talk about is biodrilling with roots for it, and crop species and root architectures and genetics even matter here. And we'll talk a little bit about that briefly. But the thing that I want to get across is that, when you move from something that's intense tillage and you have this plow pan down here, and you move into what you want to be a long-term no-till or long-term reduced till, such as that shallow vertical till, there's going to be pockets and zones that are still compacted, but the idea with biodrilling is to drill roots through those areas so your next crop, when you plant it, those roots can get in those channels, move down, move laterally, and still explore that soil. It still gets water infiltrating in, water moving and aeration occurring through those compacted areas. They're still there, but they have this new network of pores to where the water, air, and the roots can take advantage of and still thrive very well with it. So that's the idea for it with them. And I really like this paper that came out in 2017. This shows some 3D CT scans of soils to where above this red line is soil that's not compacted. Below the red line is where they induced a compaction layer in it, and they grew tillage radish, which is a dicot with a taproot, obviously, vetch dicot with a fibrous root system, and then something like a black oat or even oats, basically a monocot with fibrous root systems for it. And in the first couple weeks, the root systems, you can see they take off, they start exploring, they have a lot of lateral roots, exploring just fine in that top bit. There is some getting down into that compaction layer. But then when we jump forward a couple months later, you can kind of see really the different architectures and morphologies of these plants really kind of emerge here. This tillage radish, the taproot, once it started forming, it basically stayed up in that non-compacted zone. The bottom of that taproot was actually pretty much a sensor for where is the compaction line. Now, the good part is that you get these, what some call kind of fanging of roots, these finer roots that come off the bottom of that taproot that's penetrating down deeper into the compaction layer, creating some pores in it. You can see there's not many lateral pores roots occurring like up here on the taproot part, but it's still able to get down into it. The vetch part, that dicot with the fibrous root system, basically it really struggled. And even when it found a spot to go down into that compaction layer, you don't see any lateral root systems coming off of it. So it's kind of has a minimal impact for it. Now that black oat or the monocot with the fibrous root system, that pretty much kept going as if the compaction layer wasn't even there. And that's a really great example of using plant species to kind of get down and get what you want, creating those initial pores so that a subsequent crop can go through. So the thing to keep in mind with this is that when you mix them up, you get a variety of pore systems that develop that can benefit the subsequent crops on it. Because still note that this monocot with the fibrous root system, there's not really any lateral roots coming off of it like that vetch or the upper part of the tillage radish for it, which could be a benefit to it. So a lot of times when we think of compaction, we go straight for the tillage radish, but still bear in mind those fibrous root systems from the monocots are very powerful and strong. That's how the prairie soil structure emerged, was from a lot of these fibrous root systems from grass species on them. So definitely leverage those and leverage it in your crop rotation. Diversifying your crop rotation is a very good opportunity to kind of start remediating compaction, just not with cover crops per se, but with your actual crop rotation. And at least up here, we have a lot of options on crop species that we can use, which is great. Again, when you're out in the field or your farmers are out in the field, if they plant something like a radish and they see this happen, see how these fang roots, they're not down, they're going off to the lateral. This tillage radish got a good size, but it couldn't actually break down into that compaction layer. And in this case, it's not actually doing much of anything in that compacted layer. It's just basically serving as a sensor for where is your compaction layer. And in this case, you'll start thinking about, okay, I need to mix up the crop species or something else, or use a different approach for it. And something just to keep on the radar, this was an awesome paper that came out just last week. Basically, this has implications for plant breeding in the future, but one of the mechanisms that's been discovered for why roots don't go into a compacted layer is not only because of the mechanical resistance to it, but because when those roots start building up ethylene in them, the volatile hormone, if it can't gas it off because it's compacted around it and it accumulates in that root, it will actually signal to the root to invest in roots elsewhere and not continue that root growth in that particular root. So we may see some crop breeding in the future in a few upcoming years that are actually targeted for creating varieties and modifications to have crops that specifically target alleviating compaction by reducing their sensitivity to this volatile hormone ethylene. The other option out there is natural cracking, particularly during the midsummer. And this is where the clay mineralogy starts mattering. So just a few images here real quick. If we just take a soil and we zoom in to like a square inch, this is probably what you'd see underneath the electron microscope. You might see some gypsum crystals and other larger fragments, but our clays kind of look like this wavy material up here. And if we zoom in more, it kind of looks like torn tissue paper. You see it's kind of irregular all over the place, but if we zoom in even more, This is what individual layers, these almost thread-like structures, that's individual clays on them, kind of stacked together. And you see that we've got illite clays here that are only a nanometer in thickness in between them. And then smectites, which are about 1.3 nanometers difference in between the thickness of them. And that little bit of thickness differences, the mechanisms behind why they have different thicknesses are what basically allow smectites to shrink and swell, and illites, they will not shrink and swell. And these are the two dominant clay minerals that we have in our region here. And so if you have soils that are rich in these smectites, when they're wet, they're expanded out. You can almost think of kind of like a scissor lifts where they're lifted all the way up. And then when they start drying, the scissor lifts come down, and then they dry some more and they go all the way to the bottom, and they shrink and swell in this fabric that's in the soil for it. And so when they start shrinking, you can build up tensile stresses and they'll start cracking, obviously. And so you'll get these deep lateral cracks, and these cracks, I mean, they might only be, half an inch at the surface, but they might go down 4 or 5 feet down into the ground, much deeper than anything mechanical. And once those vertical cracks initiate into, you start getting these lateral cracks that crack into the blocks in between. And you can see over on this structure right here. And those are very important for roots to be able to get in, and gas and water flows to be able to penetrate that soil and let root systems and plants explore that root zone that's down there, even though it's still compacted. And so in these areas, the cracking, even though when they get wet and they swell shut again, those cracks will reopen in the same spots. If you don't go in and mechanically mix it up, it doesn't have to restart the process over of trying to find a spot to crack. And from the tensile stresses, they'll just open and shut in the same spots for it. So once you start seeing them crack, you know that it's doing its job with creating structure in those compacted zones. So when does this compaction happen? Well, it happens when it's wet. So these clays are hydrated and they're swollen. And the important part with that is because when you drive across them, even if you get ruts and stuff, there's only partial compaction compared to what the maximum state could be. And it's because the driving over it is very brief. You're driving fast enough to where you can't squeeze the water out of those individual clays for it. So when they subsequently dry, there's still room to shrink, and those tensile stresses build up and crack, and you get this network of vertical and secondary lateral cracks that'll form in it. So a lot of times, you might think it's like, well, it's compacted enough, there's no room to still crack. Oh, there certainly is. And so where does this happen? This is a map that can kind of help you with this. This was put together by Dr. Boo and Franzen for it. And this is a map of smectite to illite ratios, at least in the state of North Dakota. Unfortunately, I don't have one for Minnesota. But in these areas, the 3 darkest areas are areas where cracking soils are going to be very common. The white and the lightest gray areas, those are areas where cracking, you might find some pockets in the clay and clay loam soils where it still happens, but the odds are kind of against you. You may not have this as a natural mechanism to help alleviate that deeper compaction for it. The other one I usually hear folks talk about or ask about, this is actually the one I get asked about the most, is what about freeze-thaw during the winter? Well, this is good for surface compaction pretty much almost exclusively, and not the deep stuff. And the reason is, and I encourage you to go on to like the Indon Center and take a look at their deep soil temperatures and watch it happen for your local area, is that in the top 6 to 8 inches, you'll see many freeze-thaw cycles within a winter. And those are the depths of conventional tillage depths where our surface compaction is at. But below that, you typically, in those deeper zones, you only get 1 freeze and you only get 1 thaw every winter. And an important part for freeze-thaw cycles to work is that they have to have many freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw. So, in a winter, you might have a dozen or 2 dozen freeze-thaw cycles in the top 6 inches, and that'll break up compaction. That'll break up compaction from the loads back in, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But with the current loads and how deep compaction goes, it just simply isn't going to reach down to the depths of where the compaction's at least not efficiently. Because if you need 2 dozen freeze-thaw cycles to be able to bust up compaction by leveraging the expanding of ice, those deeper zones that you're not going to get it 1 year, you're not going to get in 2 years. It's going to be a multi-year, probably multi-decade process. And at that point, it's not very useful to you. So don't rely on freeze-thaw practices to do that. And I can tell you, even out around Bismarck on some coal mine reclamation work we did, even after 40 years on those compacted lands out there, there's just no evidence of freeze-thaw cycles doing anything to help alleviate compaction. The other option is if you got like an inline subsoiler or paraplow, that's basically not doing any mixing up on the surface, leaving all the residue on the ground. These they tend to have poor odds of working and little gain when it does. And I want to show you an example of this because I get this asked a lot. And I'll show this diagram here to where it's Snyder from 2017. This is basically a study of studies. So they had over, I believe, 1,500 observations in this. Right here at 1 in the middle is where the yields from deep ripping or subsoiling was the same as the compacted control area. Everything in red is when subsoiling caused a loss in yields. Everything in blue is when subsoiling caused an increase in yields. And most of the times folks see this and they say, wow, look at all that blue, man, that's the way to go, especially if I can get up to 50% increase in my yields on that. It's tempting to think that, but this is, until you put some numbers to it to put it in context, it actually doesn't work that way. If you look at this white box in the middle, I bring this to your attention just for the moment. This is the middle 50th percentile of everyone where they'd fall. This black line right in the middle, that's right. You know, half the folks are less than that. Half the folks are more than that. So this is your 50th percentile. The edge of the box is your bottom 20th percentile. And then the top of the box over here is your getting to the top 75 percentile and then up to 100 percentile over here. So on these, the reason why I point that out is because let's run a scenario here. Let's go back to those consequences I mentioned earlier to where if you know you have compaction, you know, you might, if you're anywhere from the 25 percentile to 75 percentile in severity, you might be in between 15 to 35% yield losses. Let's take those and say we're doing like corn and we got 180 bushels was our prior yields on it. And we applied these yield consequences for these different levels of severity. You'd see yields drop down to about 153 down to 117 bushels per acre of what you could expect due to that deep compaction for the next couple of years. If you went in and you did an inline subsoiler for it and you hit the median, so you're right in the middle, you know, half the people did worse than you, half the people did better than you. So you're right here at this middle line. That's around 4% increase. So if we applied a 4% increase to those, it'd bump us up to in between 159 to 122 bushels per acre. It went up, but that's not something to really be overly thrilled about considering the time and money that went into that ripping. So how much do we really need to fully alleviate those effects? What do we need that 4% to get up to? We actually need it up around that 18 to 54%. We need to be up in the top 25 percentile performance of deep ripping out there. So, and I'll just tell you that everyone thinks that they're in the top 25 percentile of ripping at least. And for every one person that's right, three people are unfortunately going to be disappointed. So it's just not very reliable, and you can still only get down to about that 20-inch depth. So which compaction can easily go below that for it. And when this happens is really when you get in that top 25 percentile range. That's really when you absolutely do have a root limiting zone that is present and you can get underneath it to lift and break into it. And when that soil doesn't have high quantities of silt. Silty soil does not respond well whatsoever to deep ripping or inline subsoils or paraplows for it. So if you have silty soils, definitely keep that in the fence row or the tree row because it's going to do more damage than good. One way too is that actually if the soil fertility wasn't all that great, you'll potentially be up in this area. If you really lean on getting your fertility down, you'll actually get closer back down here to this no gain area for it. And when you hit a significant drought that next year. And this is just kind of a graphical representation of the same thing I just said there, where the thicker the bar, the more likely it was true for it. And one of the reasons why you get all this negative red out here too is because if you have some of these other means with bio drilling and natural cracking that's helping alleviate those compacted control areas. If you go in with a deep ripper inline subsoiler and actually damages some of those gains that's naturally happening through those other mechanisms, that's where you can see this red area start popping in. You might be down in there, so because it's actually disrupting some of the things that are leaning towards being of your farmer's benefits. The last thing I want to mention real quick is occasional tillage. And here the time since last tillage matters a lot. Now, I will be very clear that there is very few published studies in the literature on this strategy where folks have done this, where they've taken something that's been in long-term no-till or long-term vertical till, shallow vertical till that's only going down like an inch or 2 or 3, and started chiseling it or doing something else to try to alleviate compaction in it. So there's not a lot available, but from what is available, if you're in those long-term systems, a single chiseling can have a benefit for about 1 year to alleviate the compaction in that tillage depth. Nothing below it, just in the depth of where the chisel went through. And that's if you hit it while that soil is generally dry. And the last time that you had tilled that soil was probably 5 to 10 years in the past. If you're less than 5 years, so you're in this transitional period, transitional no-till, transitional reduced tillage, then you've likely not had time to build up the soil structure and let that structure strengthen. That where when that chisel goes through or those shanks go through, you're not breaking, pulverizing, or kneading up the structure and destroying it. If you're older than that 5 year, getting into the 10-year range or older, then there probably is sufficient time for to be very strong soil structure that can hold together. And if you go in and you do a one-time chiseling, you can alleviate the compaction in that depth for about the next year without destroying too much of the structure, as long as it's done when it wasn't really sopping wet out there too. However, I want to emphasize that this is really best reserved simply for filling ruts for if and when they do occur. So save it for that. In those worst of worst situations, like if you hit a 2019 and the timing for getting into harvesting just left you with not many options without causing ruts on things. So kind of to end things off here, I want to really just emphasize kind of being preemptive in strategizing on these. So, focus on alleviating the current compaction. If you have it, make sure it's there before you go after it. A lot of times we think a soil is compacted and it's actually not. So use a penetrometer, get a feel. Do you really see that bulb of compaction in your penetrometer readings before you try to go after something mechanically? But alleviate the current compaction and then minimize the mechanical disturbances to it. So the number of passes on the field with heavy equipment, especially grain carts. Grain carts are incredibly heavy. And then obviously your tillage, if you're in a reduced tillage system to it, if you're vertical till, leave the compact disc off and just focus on minimizing your number of passes out there to help protect from that future compaction that's on it. If you can get as many root systems and diversity, both by your crop rotation, but then also looking into what options of cover cropping is, you can get the bio drilling to start to benefit to you. That takes a few years to really start benefiting, because not only does the roots have to first get down into that compacted zone, but then those roots have to have a year or two to rot out. That way they open up and then let the next crop going in. So you're not going to plant them 1 year and see an immediate benefit the next crop, because those previous roots are still rotting out. That's part of the time cycle to know ahead of time. If you got these cracking soils, definitely let them get rid of the deep stuff for you. That's one benefit we have up here that many other places in the U.S. does not have at their disposal. And then mostly, really work on keeping loads light, because the equipment's heavy, and that's what makes compaction difficult to deal with these days, is because of the high loads that we have. Adjusting the tire pressures, you might look into an auto inflate system and keeping, the tire pressures in the field down to around a quarter of what they would be out on the roads. And minimizing the number of passes on those fields to help avoid chances for ruts to where you get those deeper compaction. and really lean into leveraging the crop diversity options that we have up here. You know, if you can get in some short seasons into your rotation, particularly with these wet harvests that we've been having in previous years, it just helps you to shift your timeline to where you're not trying to build up the strength and structure of your soil to where then you stand up and your equipment will stay on top and not compact. It'll help you get to that point sooner rather than, you know, ended up like a 2019 harvest where you may have every single pass being rutted up during harvest. That then just sets you back to your time clock back to zero for transitioning into a long-term system. And then also, you know, with the crop residue management out there, something on those wet fields, if you're concerned about in the transition period having higher amounts of residue, you know, leave the stock standing. Choppers will, on the combines, they'll create a thick mat, and that's just hard to get stuff to dry out when you have that thick mat. So leave stock standing, really get to know your planters. The planters these days and the adjustments that we can do to them are fantastic for going with high residue conditions and get a really good start off to your crop stand from them. And the last thing I'll just say I like this series of photos is from over in Ohio. They've got some similar soils to us, at least oolitic wise, on the clay soils for it, to where if you got a soil that's heavily tilled and subsoiled, this is probably what it looked like for a lot of folks back in 2019. But as you start going into transitioning into it, if you get some nice years, you know, the first year you still may be having some ruts on it. You get into areas where you're in the 2-year cycle, you'll see those ruts may not be so deep. And then once you get long term, you'll actually be standing up on the ground when everyone else is buried up to the axle for it. So it's getting through that transition time and really leaning off of the mechanical means of trying to alleviate the compaction and leveraging these cracking soils and biodrilling to help get you to what you need if you have a compacted soil that you're going into this transition period with. So if you have any questions or want to go into any more detail, we only had 30 minutes, so it's not very long, but always feel free to reach out to me at aaron.day@ndsu.edu. I'm more than happy to chat with everyone. So thank you.